Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Environmental Storage Considerations for Forensic Evidence. We are very grateful that you took time today to join us for this class, and we are hoping to provide you some excellent information. We have a great guest speaker with us today, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. We would also like to thank IAPE for helping put this class together. Specific Ellen, thank you for getting our guest speaker today. I'm very grateful for that and just taking the time to be able to make this happen. For those of you who have not attended one of our webinars yet or know who IAPE is, they help provide training around property and evidence management, and they've actually been doing that since 1993. They've instructed well over 25,000 property room professionals in all 50 states, and that's including the provinces of Canada. This training, I would highly recommend if you've never taken part in it, especially in today's climate in the world. That evidence you have in your custody is needing to be managed better and better for your accountability, for your transparency, and just for your confidence, because there's great risk around managing property and evidence, and IAPE is going to help assure that. If you're directly associated and in the property room, or if you're a supervisor that manages the property room, understanding those complexities, those nuances, the liabilities around your property and evidence is very important. And also they're going to provide you certification. They can provide you certification along with that if you're needing that certification be associated with your training in your agency. A little bit about us. We are what we call a public safety solutions company. We provide software and expertise and training around software and just evidence, procedures, and policies. We are made up of former law enforcement, and our goal is we want to provide you more than just great software, but at the end of the day, be able to give you that accountability, help you reach that compliance, that efficiency, and ultimately really give you the confidence that you need in managing property and evidence, because I know that sometimes you have concerns around how you're doing your jobs, and especially as I shared earlier in the climate today, doing that is probably more important than ever. A little bit about how we do that is we are a platform solutions company, so we're a little bit different than just your traditional evidence software system out there. And the reason I say that is our platform is of three distinct parts that all work together, are fully integrated together, or can work independently, and that's for your physical evidence, your digital evidence, and your found property. So a lot of times there's a disconnect in being able to either get that property back to the owners, or for the owners to be able to know you have it. And that found drop part of it helps solve that problem, and all three of these work tightly together. And by doing this, we're able to really serve the whole public safety sector. Everyone has a need regarding property and evidence, and so it's not just for the people that are in the property room, but it's all the stakeholders at play. If it's getting reports, it's being able to view digital evidence remotely, if it's being able to get in there and get what they need when they need it. And this is the beauty of this platform. And at the end of the day, it's really about the people you serve. It's about the community, it's about your victims, it's about your owners, and being able to have that confidence and transparency for them. Through this platform, we provide that. And so we're very excited about it, and we would love to be able to show you more about it at some point if you're interested. We are based out of Seattle, Washington. We're well represented across the United States. We represent around 375 agencies, and we have a very high level of satisfaction, and I really attribute that to because we're made up of former law enforcement, so we understand where your needs are, we understand where your pain points are, and we give you solutions that you tailor, not that we tailor for you. So that's kind of the beauty of it, is it kind of fits your needs. A little bit about the class today is you are muted, so you can have conversations amongst yourself, but we realize you are going to have questions during this class today. And so we're giving you a way to submit those questions through the questions interface in the GoToWebinar area there that should be on your right-hand side, or the control panel. So you can just click that little drop down if it's folded up and submit those questions at any time. We're going to do our very best to address those during this class, either texting, typing back to you, or we'll actually share those questions with the entire group as we get towards the end of the class. Okay, I have rambled long enough, and I am very excited to introduce to you Marcela Najarro. She is a research chemist who's responsible for driving the strategic direction and execution of forensic science research programs within NIST's material laboratory. Her role is that she utilizes her technical and leadership experience to manage the forensic science research programs across the drugs and toxins and trace evidence portfolios. Through close collaboration with federal and state and local stakeholders, her portfolio helps strengthen the scientific foundation of multiple forensic disciplines. So in a nutshell, she's extremely knowledgeable and going to be able to provide you a wealth of great information today, and we're very excited to have her. And so thank you, Marcela, for joining us. And I would also like to thank Joe Latta and Ellen Spain and Rick Meadows for joining us. They'll be in the background to help facilitate the class where needed, or maybe answer a few of those questions. And Joe has something to share at the end. And one more thing before I pass this off to Marcela is this class is being recorded. So sometime tomorrow, you'll get a link to this class if you want to watch it or share it with someone later for further review. So just give you a heads up on that. Okay, I think from here, Marcela, are you out there?
I'm here.
Yay, all right. So Marcela, I'm going to pass this off to you and make you presenter. You should get a prompt on your end. You can share your screen when you're ready.
Just waiting for that prompt, Craig.
Okay, all right. I can send it one more time. Okay, and send it again.
Not seeing it.
Okay. I'm going to pass it off one more time and see if it comes through this time. Might have a little bit of technical lag to make sure I got through to you okay.
I've got it now. Let me know when you can see my screen.
Okay, great.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Craig, for that very kind introduction. Again, everyone, my name is Marcela Najarro, and I'm a research chemist at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for your attention in advance. Today, I'll be discussing environmental storage considerations for forensic evidence. Just a quick disclaimer, the points of views are my own and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of NIST. I might mention certain commercial equipment, instruments, or materials, but in no way does that such identification imply a recommendation or an endorsement by NIST. Okay, so let's get started. When we discuss forensic evidence and its storage, we typically use the word preservation. And what exactly does preservation mean? And what is the dictionary definition, and what is it that we're actually trying to accomplish? So one of the definitions is to maintain something in its original or existing state. The other one is to keep intact or free from decay, and to keep it safe from harm or destruction. All three of those elements are something that people in your field are interested in doing. But when we talk about preservation from the standpoint of what can happen to it due to environmental conditions, really our goal is to maximize preservation. And as you'll see throughout my presentation, some evidence is more labile and can be affected by the environment more than other. And so for the most part, we're really just trying to maximize preservation in all of its capacities. So why do we preserve evidence? As you all are well aware of, we do so because we need to comply with evidence retention laws. These laws can vary from state to state, depending on case status and crime category. We do so because of reanalysis. Sometimes the defense expert or a court may order reanalysis of that evidence, and so we want to ensure that we've done as much as possible in order to preserve it in its original state. The other thing that evidence that's been stored long-term is really helpful is sometimes it goes back to the forensic laboratories and they use it as training aids or to audit and to look into tampering issues. And so in that case, the forensic labs are really looking to see whether the results that they put forth on the second analysis, how they compare to the first one. And so there's been a lot of a body of research that goes into figuring out what happens to this evidence as a function of time and as a function of its storage condition. And finally, preserve evidence due to advancements in technology, right? And so we want to safeguard the evidence of the future. DNA is a really good example of this, right? So it didn't exist prior to the 1980s. Went ahead and preserved that evidence anyway. And when these big advancements in technology occur, it's really helpful to be able to go back and reanalyze as much evidence and take advantage of what we know now that we didn't then. And so those are sort of the three reasons why we preserve evidence. And at the end of the day, evidence that's been preserved adequately can either help solve cases or it can help exonerate the innocent. So I'm a part of the evidence management committee that's been put together to try and come up with guidelines for your community in order to understand what are the storage guidelines to maximize the preservation of forensic evidence. And this needs to be based on peer reviewed data, right? And so research that comes out of laboratories that's been published that that others have had a chance to review and either agree with or disagree with. That's the type of data that we want to rely on when we're setting best practices. We want to make sure that it comes from independent resources. And so often you'll have companies or vendors or manufacturers that will claim that a specific for example, storage unit may be able to do certain things, but we want to make sure that all of that information is vetted by researchers and we understand what the actual capabilities and limitations are of those storage of anything that has to do with preserving the evidence. And so what we're hoping to do is in this report to come up with a storage condition matrix very similar to the one that you see on your screen. This one was done already for biological evidence. As you know, that's probably where we have the best guidance in terms of what to do depending on the type of evidence. So if you have, urine versus blood, et cetera, what type of storage condition is best. And we realize that everybody has different resources. And so because we're conscious of that and we're conscious about budget constraints when it comes to storing evidence, we ensure that we're going to have a best, but then we also have an acceptable, right? And then we want to make sure that we also label something as never. Those are the conditions that will have the most detrimental effects on your evidence. And we want to make sure that you're aware of that. So, one of the things that I saw at first when I started reviewing some of this data was that there's a need to standardize the terminology. A lot of times we start talking past one another because we simply don't understand what these terms mean, right? And so we want to make sure that the community of practice, and in this case, that includes the hospitals and the courts, have a common understanding of what the recommended parameters are going to be for environmental storage conditions. And so when somebody says something needs to be frozen, it needs to be at or below -10°C, for example. When somebody says something is temperature controlled, that means a certain range in temperature, but it also includes a range in humidity, which I will discuss in a little bit, the importance of humidity when it comes to storage conditions. Room temperature is also something that needs to be defined just because that's going to be different, right, depending on whose room we're discussing. And so terminology is important. At this point, I think we're going to stop for a poll question.
Okay, Marcella, I'll bring up that first poll question and share it with everyone. We're going to bring up a poll. You'll see it on your screen. You'll be able to interact with it and give your answers there. And these are anonymous. I'm just going to get some results and so kind of get the gauge where everyone is in the class. So this is the first question we have for everyone. I'm going to launch this poll, and it says, does your evidence room have any environmental monitoring for temperature and humidity? So just answer the best that you can. And looks like we've got about 30% voted in. So it's going up quick here. I'll let everyone just everyone a little bit more time. We're about 70%. Let it go a little longer. Okay, I think I'm gonna go ahead and close out that poll now, and I will share the results with everyone here in the class. So I'm gonna share those results, and looks like 49% said yes, and 45% said no, and 6 don't know. So we got a pretty good split there, Marcella, on who have those environmental monitoring at their agencies.
Great. All right. So at this point, I will Continue with the presentation. That's great to know. So let's dive in a little bit deeper into what I mean by environmental condition storage facilities. So when we say temperature controlled facilities, that means that you're managing the temperature of the facility. However, when we talk about climate controlled facilities, that means that we're managing both temperature and humidity. Both humidity and temperature work together in order to control the moisture levels in the storage space. And so it's important to understand the relationship between the two. And as humidity in the air increases, the air's ability to hold that heat increases. And we all know that, right, by traveling to different parts of the country, and when they say it's really, really hot, but it's dry, right? Or you travel to somewhere like in the South, where if you haven't been, the humidity is unbearable, even though it might be the same temperatures that you're usually used to. And so conversely, when humidity decreases, it also keeps the temperatures low. And so you'll see that temperatures rise relative to the humidity pretty quickly. And so those two things play a big factor in terms of the environmental conditions to which your forensic evidence is exposed to if you haven't thought about it that way. So what are the effects of these environmental conditions? One of them is condensation. And you'll see this a lot, again, in those areas where it's very, very humid. You'll start to see droplets of water forming on top of surfaces. And this can sometimes affect, depending on how the evidence is packaged, you can introduce moisture to your evidence due to condensation. Evaporation and volatilization is certainly an issue for things such as explosives, things that are very sensitive to temperature. You can sometimes notice such things if you had to, for example, weigh like a liquid prior to entering how much of it you received, and then you store it for a long time, and then you weigh it again, and you may see that you've either lost material, and that would be because it's volatilized into the air and you've lost it. But conversely, sometimes you've gained weight and you wonder, where did this extra weight come from? And in that case, sometimes you may be, again, gaining moisture, right? So there may be more water content in your forensic evidence than you had prior to that. And that speaks to hygroscopic. So hygroscopic materials are those that absorb water very readily and can be changed due to that. The other one to think about is photodegradation. That's if something is exposed to light, and UV rays can definitely affect some of the evidence, and I'll show you a couple of examples in a couple of minutes on how that can be potentially bad for preserving evidence. There's bacterial and microbial degradation, and sometimes we see that with biologicals, right? And so that's why we have to put them in the freezer. And there can be chemical breakdowns, and we have to be aware of anything, an artifact, anything that wasn't there when the evidence was first stored, but is now there due to long-term storage and as a factor of any environmental condition that might have affected it. These are the types of environmental conditions that we know are worst, right, for evidence. And so extreme temperatures, and we'll talk a little bit about what those are. Luckily, what the research shows, and I'll show you some of that literature, is that about 70 degrees, 70 to 75, I believe is the range, is typically just fine for evidence. They don't need these special, conditions. However, large fluctuations in temperature and extreme temperatures are definitely not good. And we'll see how we can sometimes reach those temperatures without even knowing it. Again, we talked about moisture and humidity and how that needs to be monitored as well to understand how that interplays with the temperature that the evidence is actually experiencing, light and fungus and mold and insects. And so this is an example of how those extreme temperatures can be reached without us really sometimes knowing. So at 70 degrees on a sunny day, for example, after 30 minutes, the temperature inside your car can be 104. After 1 hour, it can go up to 113 degrees. And so now we're talking about extreme temperatures. But when you think about that, you're saying, well, it's 70 degrees outside, right? I'm not really worried about anything happening to the evidence that's in the back of my car as I'm transporting it from place A to place B. But as you'll see, inside of the car can reach those extreme temperatures very, very fast. In fact, if it's 80 to 100 degrees, right, just like right now in the summertime, the temperature inside of a parked car on direct sunlight can climb all the way to 130 to 172 degrees. So that's something that we need to think about, how to mitigate those types of extreme temperatures when you're transporting your evidence. And so in this, I've spent a lot of time with folks in your community, and they've tried to explain to me, you know, how the evidence moves from place to place, and where sometimes the evidence may be stored temporarily, and those are those squares in green that you'll see. So perhaps it could be at a hospital, it's stored temporarily, or at a prison facility. It then moves right into either an evidence vault at a forensics lab, where it's also temporary storage, or police stations. But you'll see the vehicles here, and all of these times the evidence is potentially exposed to extreme temperatures, and that can go, you know, from extreme heat, but it could also refer to extreme cold temperatures, which can cause thawing or other issues as well. And so the point of this slide is for you to consider every time that the storage is in temporary storage and or being transported, that these environmental considerations should still be in play. And while it's more difficult to maybe safeguard the evidence while it's in a car, we'll talk about some things that can be done, you know, in order to mitigate some of these issues. I've heard a lot about the issues of the evidence being stored in courts, and how they sometimes don't have the right protocols, guidelines, or even awareness of these sorts of things. And so I'm aware of that, and hopefully we can work as a community to come up with recommendations that can be broad enough that they apply to all of these different scenarios in which the evidence can be either temporarily stored or long-term storage. So with that, I'd like to launch into the second poll question.
Okay, Marcella, I'll bring up another poll question for everyone here. So number 2, I'm going to launch that poll right now. And it says, in your evidence room, what type of temporary storage do you use? And that's a kind of a multiple choice there. So you may use one of those, you may use all of those. So just select whatever fits your department. And it looks like we've got people thinking about it. So we're up to about 20% here. I'll let it keep going. Okay, we're going up to about 70%. I'm gonna let it go just a little bit longer, and then I'll close out this poll. I know there's a number of things to choose, so I'll give it a little bit longer than usual. Okay, I think I'll close that poll. Looks like most people have responded, and I will share those results with everyone. Okay, so it looks like the temporary storage, they're using, 52% are using rooms and closets. 49% are home refrigerators, 47% are commercially manufactured evidence in freezers and refrigerators, 68% commercially manufactured evidence lockers, and then we got some of none of the above, which would be interesting to know what they're using. So that's good. Thank you for sharing, everyone. Back to you, Marcella.
Thank you so much, Craig. Okay, so let's dive into a little bit more about temporary storage equipment. So the environmental requirements for temporary storage are the exact same as those for long-term storage. So I'm happy to hear that some of you have the resources and the budget to have these commercially manufactured or commercially storage containers. And here you'll see the units used for temporary storage in order of best. Right, so best you'd have evidence lockers, and then so on and so forth. So just something to think about. Home refrigerators are obviously maybe not as good as commercially manufactured and as commercial containers, so on and so forth. The rooms and closets, we obviously assume that there is climate control there, so you are monitoring both the temperature and also the climate, the humidity. So what about when evidence is being transported from place A to place B, right? And we don't have these evidence storage conditions that are more ideal. So these are some examples that I thought about as cost-effective options, right? Because a lot of times we're really making really tough decisions and in terms of budget. So can we really buy all of these things that are going to preserve the evidence while there's a lot of different pulls in terms of where to put your resources into? So some of the things that I've thought about is, for example, insulated bags. We all use them to go to the grocery store, right? We want to make sure that our groceries, and if you pick up some chicken and some yogurt and maybe something like that that we know is more sensitive to temperature, we put them into these insulated bags where we may be able to stuff them with ice packs just to be able to preserve them. And this is an idea that I think that is, again, cost effective. Departments could easily provide people with them. The other thing is desiccants. A lot of times when you order packages, say from Amazon, or you get anything in there, you might notice these silica gel packs. They're meant to absorb moisture. And so for those of you that are located in very, very humid environments, you can buy these. I think they're like just a couple of cents, like 7 cents per pack. You can buy them in bulk and just stuff them into spaces where you're going to have to be transporting your evidence. And they're really, really good at absorbing the moisture from the air. The other one that I want to point out to, this comes from Amazon.com. I believe the price is like under $20. This is a temperature and humidity sensor. And so if your rooms don't have that sensor already as a part of them and you're working with an older system, this actually logs it, and it'll give you both the temperature and the humidity of that room. And you can set it to where if it actually reaches a temperature that where you've said is not okay, it will alert you, right? And so it'll tell you that it's too high. So if you set your moisture, you want it around 60%, for example, it will actually let you know if something's gone wrong. So that's something that we use in the field when we're doing research out there, and we want to make sure that our samples, we want to make sure, for example, that our samples are still stable from, or the same from when we left the lab to when we go to the field. We take one of these and use it to make sure that if there are any discrepancies in our samples, we can attribute it to perhaps an issue with the temperature or humidity. On the other end, there are tons of companies and manufacturers that are working on more advanced technology. There's something called the TTI, which is a time temperature indicator, and that's a device. It's like a smart label that can shows you the time temperature history, right? And so you would stick it in your package, and it would tell you whether it's either gone again past a certain limit that you'd like. These things are already being used to ship things like food and pharmaceuticals and medical products, and so we're not reinventing the wheel here, but we would certainly be borrowing technology that's already out there for different applications and seeing hopefully how it works for your purposes. And again, here the point is to have something that would indicate exposure to excessive temperatures. So this is something to think about. This is something to keep an eye on. And as more and more industries are making use of these, luckily the price for them are coming down. And I know that the future, hopefully, of forensics includes something like this, where it's monitoring both the temperature, the humidity, and maybe even giving you details about where that evidence has been. Craig, if we could go to poll question number 3 at this point.
You bet. I'll pull that poll up right now. So I'm going to launch this poll for everyone. You should get it on your screen now. And it says, do you have a procedure in place that maintains the ideal storage temperature of evidence being transported? So it looks like people are chiming in pretty quickly here. We're about 40%. And let it go a little bit longer. We're about 80%. Let a few of these you stragglers out there get your answers in. And I'm going to go ahead and close this poll out and share those results with everyone. And I'll share those results right now. It looks like, Marcella, it looks like about 12% do have something in place for that storage temperature, and 84% do not, and 5% don't know. Interesting.
Okay. Yeah,
okay.
Sure. So, and that's pretty common from what I've heard from the community. And so this is just an attempt to start that conversation, to start thinking about ways in which we can cost effectively start to manage the exposure of the evidence while it's in transport. Again, I understand that it's, not sometimes feasible, but especially for those of you who aren't unable to bring the evidence from point A to point B right away and there's a time issue in between two. And you have to really consider where you're putting that evidence. The trunk, for example, is going to get much hotter than, you know, probably the inside of the car. You have to consider things like, is it going to off gas and then potentially cause an exposure issue to whoever's in the car? Lots of things to discuss there. But I'd like to switch gears a little bit and start to discuss the literature review. And this is something that I've been tasked to do within this evidence management committee. Again, going back and to see what sort of research data is already out there that can help guide us into best practices for the temporary and long-term storage of evidence. And it's going to vary depending on the type of evidence that you have. And so, you know, these are all of the different types of evidence. It wouldn't be prudent for us to come up with one umbrella best practice that applies to all of these. But I think we have to think about which of these types of evidence are most sensitive, and then start working our way from there. And so just to start off with toxicology, they actually have the largest body of research that's investigated the stability of samples as a function of the storage condition and time. And so, you know, what their struggles are is that it could be, again, the type of evidence can be in different matrices. So it could either be in blood or it could be in urine. And as you'll see, depending on the matrix, frozen is either best or refrigerated is best. But there's been lots and lots of studies. There's been toxicology labs who have held on to their samples for long periods of time. This is really what you want to see when you start doing these literature reviews, right? We've done a before and after study between 16 to 18 years, and it's in these particular samples. Unfortunately, that's not what the case for the rest of the evidence, but I think for toxicology would be able to give some pretty good best practices because of all of the research that's already out there. But as you'll see, it's going to depend on what types of drugs are inside of your sample. So that will require a pre-analysis in order to know that. So maybe you'll have guidance for the long-term storage, but for the first, we'll have to come up with something that's more robust that would say, okay, you don't know what you have in this sample, but this is probably what's best for most of the potential drugs that are part of it. The second one is, and I think this is probably going to be one of the most interesting parts of the talk for this audience, is drug exposures, potentially drug exposures in evidence rooms, right? And so I wanted to make you aware that for those of you that may not know, that the CDC did a study where they evaluated police officers' exposures to chemicals while working inside of a drug vault. This happened in Kentucky. And it happened because the employer submitted an evaluation request because employees that were working in the vault that's used to store the evidence were experiencing some health symptoms. And so this is actually something that folks can put in a request to the CDC, and they tend to be, they either point you to a resource where, you know, they say, hey, this is something that's already been done, and here's the findings from that study. And if they find that they haven't actually researched this area enough, they will come out, it's free of cost, and actually assess the workplace and conduct a number of studies. We actually just encouraged a local forensics lab that was concerned with exposure to fentanyls and whether the you know, how they were receiving the evidence and how the evidence was being stored and moving throughout the forensics lab. They wanted to make sure that they were reducing as much risk as possible. They came in, they monitored the drug chemist for a number of days. They assessed their HVAC systems. They reviewed the policies that were in place. They reviewed the protective equipment that they were using, and that report was just recently published. And so I think that this is an excellent resource for any of you who are concerned about the conditions in which the evidence vaults are. And, you know, there's been lots of extra worry, I think, now that the fentanyls and the opioids are a big potential risk. You know, how do you label those and how do you minimize exposure? I'll talk about some of the recommendations that came out of this report, but here's a link to where you can find a lot of resources specifically on fentanyl, but then there's also lots of other links about studies that are similar to the one that we're discussing right now. In terms of the temperature, they found that most of the temperatures and relative humidity levels in this particular vault were acceptable. But they noticed that they do repeated visits, right? And when they came back in July, that relative humidity level was above that 50% that they are concerned with because it promotes mold growth. So just to clarify, the CDC doesn't come in to assess whether the evidence is being stored properly from a preservation standpoint, but they come in with the lens of potential exposure to the workers. And so any of the recommendations that you'll see is typically guided towards ensuring that it's safe and that the risks have been mitigated. So they've recommended provided conditioned air at relative humidity between 30 and 50% in the drug vault throughout the entire year to help minimize mold growth. So what other recommendations came out of this study? One of them was to dispose of the drugs as frequently as possible in order to reduce the amount of material in the drug vault that could off-gas and potentially expose employees. So I know that that's just all dependent on how fast you can move your evidence through your vaults, and there's a lot of things at play that don't necessarily that aren't necessarily in your control, but just for your knowledge, the more drugs that are in there that are not disposed, the more potential there is for off-gassing and for exposure of the employees. In terms of engineering controls, they came up with lots of different recommendations that can be implemented. Again, dry your marijuana and other plant-based drugs prior to storage. I think most people are doing this already in order to reduce the odors and the mold growth. Putting your drying chamber inside of the drug vault was recommended in order to prevent the odors and the particles from entering your entire HVAC system. So this might be something that you might take away from this presentation and say, can we actually move the drying chamber inside of the vault? Replacing the organic vapor and particulate filters that come into drying chamber at a minimum according to manufacturer guidelines, but often they notice that you probably need to do it more frequently if you start to smell the odors from the drying chamber exhaust. And so this is something that should probably be monitored. You should have something in place where you know that you need to replace it every so often and see whether those guidelines are appropriate for your condition, and if it needs to be sooner, then take care of that, because it would prevent the drying chamber from actually working as intended. After drying the plant-based drugs, they recommended to store them in sealed plastic bags. But they noticed that that this particular place put them in ventilated cardboard boxes. And they said place them in an enclosed area of the drug vault and use the exhaust ventilation to contain the odors. All other drugs should be sealed in plastic, and then they recommended sealing and bubble wrapping any glass containers so that you minimize breakage. So exposure risks are fairly low, but if something is stored in glass, for example, now you have the potential of having a larger risk, right? The risk that we're starting to be concerned at this point, if you don't know what the powder is, for example, the cleanup, the potential inhalation of any of the powders that have fallen, all of those into consideration. And so they recommend having other things in place in order to avoid any breakage. Transporting, they noticed that to reduce exposures from dust or volatiles, anything that's coming off gassing to use a truck with a lockable bed enclosure when transporting the drugs to and from the police department. I realize that this may not be possible, but just to think about maybe having a lockable enclosure in which you would put these things in there in order to reduce any compounds from volatilizing into the car, especially as a function of temperature, which we know can happen. Improving housekeeping practices, thoroughly clean surfaces when drug contamination is found or is likely. I can tell you that my laboratory has done a number of studies in this space, and that not in drug vaults, but in forensic labs, although I'm actually interested in maybe coming to a big storage facility to see what type of contamination is present on surfaces, because I can tell you that in the forensics lab, there is a lot of contamination on surfaces that you cannot see with your naked eye. You actually have to come in and swipe and analyze. We pretty much could tell what type of drugs are more prevalent in certain labs, and we were able to match that with the types of cases that it analyzed. We found that, for example, weighing, so dumping all the contents out of the bag that they receive it in order to get a net weight for analyzing their cases, that's one of the most that's one of the processes that contributes the most to these types of contaminations. And so we're working with the laboratory to find a way to weigh those, for example, inside of a hood rather than out in the open air. We've been able to visualize how that exposure comes out. And I'll show you a video in just a few minutes to show you how easily it is to contaminate surfaces, and how you should not always assume that the only way to expose yourself is by making contact with the inside of the package. There's, I'll show you a study where we actually analyzed the trace drugs that are found outside of the packaging, and we were able to see that there's plenty of residue present in the outside of the baggies as well. And so using things like nitrile gloves and other types of PPE is probably a good idea. Wash your hands and remove your gloves before eating, drinking. I mean, these are sort of common sense things, but they're not always possible depending on, you know, what your workspace is and what your workload is. I can certainly empathize after spending, you know, some time in these sorts of spaces, how limited the supplies can be, and how you can move from activity to activity without kind of being conscious about, you know, washing your hands. I think now that we're all experiencing COVID, we're probably more hyper alert about washing our hands, and I think a lot of times you'll notice, like, oh, I just touched my face, right, and I haven't washed my hands. These are the sorts of ways in which you can actually be exposed to things without knowing that you have come in contact with something. So something to consider. In terms of administrative controls, make sure that your employees receive all elements of a medical surveillance program. That program should include a general health questionnaire and follow up with employees who have shown any health changes. Make sure that you report any adverse health symptoms to your supervisor. And if you continue to experience those symptoms, you know, you need to go to a healthcare provider. I know that there's not a lot of evidence. People sometimes don't even know that they may be experiencing symptoms, but if you work in these inside of drug vaults, it's very reasonable to think that, you know, you have come in contact with some sort of at least trace residue, right? That can be, depending if you're wearing PPE, potentially cause some health concerns. So just something to be really conscious about. They recommend that you organize a health and safety committee consisting of management and also employee representatives to meet regularly to address any health and safety concerns, and that you should have written policies and standard operating procedures that discuss what type of required PPE needs to be worn to work inside of a drug evidence vault. So this is the study that I was alluding to earlier. A colleague and I went to a forensics lab. They let us swipe the outside of baggies that had been seized and were waiting for analyses. We swiped the outside of the packages, and then they allowed us to sample the inside of the packaging. And then we ran that by different types of analyses, and we were able to correlate we were able to identify what was inside of the package, and then we were also able to analyze what the trace residues were outside. And 92% of the time, we were able to accurately identify what was going to be inside, but just by sampling the outside. One of the reasons, one of the main motivators to do this was to maybe thinking about maybe doing a quick screen of the outside of the package, so that if it potentially contains any fentanyls, you don't have to go in there, or you actually at least know what type of PPE you need to be on higher alert, because it's very likely that there's a fentanyl inside. We did it through that lens, but then when we sort of zoomed out and started thinking about anybody and everybody that's handled that baggie that contains those substances, then we started to think about, you know, the police officer that brought it in, the evidence, the person who's intaking the evidence at the forensics lab and moving it, you know, to their temporary storage condition, and then so on and so forth. So before the scientists who, you know, may know to have the gloves on and everything, before that person touches that evidence, there's a lot of other people that have potentially touched it, and are also should also be aware that there's enough trace residues in there for us to be able to identify what's inside. As part of that background study, we also swiped benches, like the surface where the countertop where officers typically bring in the evidence, and then there's the intake process. We swiped those, and we were able to detect drugs there as well. We swiped the inside of the bins where the drugs are typically stored before the scientist comes and picks it up. We were also able to pick up lots and lots of different drug signatures from there. Again, these levels don't rise up to a big concern from a health standpoint, but it's just good to know that that's there. And that if one of those bags, for example, isn't sealed properly, then you have the potential issue of exposure. I'll just quickly note that some of these were double packed sometimes and triple packed, and we were still able to detect some trace residues on definitely the second baggie. I'd have to double check on the third one. Here's a video just to show you of how we've been able to visualize how trace contamination occurs. So this is a video of somebody pouring in drug contents, and if you see a plume of material just flew out without any, without it causing anything, right? So nobody shook it. It's just as a function of the air. And so anybody who's standing right there would have been exposed to all that particulate that comes off of here. It would also be in this person's hands if they were not wearing a gloves. And what this video doesn't show is that when that person actually closes that baggie, tons of material actually flies out also from the corner here as you go on and move on from it. We have lots of other videos like this on our website that I'd be happy to show you just to help you visualize what happens when you're moving evidence from place to place. And we're always interested in ideas from people from the outside who may help us with ideas of what other types of research would be useful for the community. This is just a heat map that shows you how far the powder went after pouring it out, for example, to weigh it inside a forensics lab. And so you'll see that depending on the airflow of the room, that particulate can be located fairly far out from where you were working on it. And so that entire bench system would have need to be cleaned. And then I didn't mention, but that report does actually provide some recommendations and some cleaners that you can use to ensure that your area is free of contamination. And with that, we'll launch into our last poll question.
Okay, Marcella, I will bring up this last poll for everyone. I'll bring that up right now. I'm going to launch that poll. And it says, I may have experienced symptoms potentially related to exposure to drug toxins in the evidence room. So let everybody chime in on this. And we're up to about 60%. People are responding very quickly here, so I'll let go just a little bit longer. Okay, about 80%. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll out now and share those results. So share those results with everyone. And it looks like about 31% have had some potentially exposure, and 50% no, and 19% are not sure.
Sure. Well, this is to tell you that, you know, it's possible. It's possible. The drug residues can travel fairly quickly through the air and redeposit onto surfaces. And luckily, what I'll say is that our research shows that if you just use a cleaner and do your cleaning frequent, you can get rid of that contamination. The other thing to keep in mind, you know, as we move on, is that we've also seen this sort of contamination on public surfaces. So like there's papers that have looked at how much trace residue is on money, at train stations, you know, rail handles and things like that, even the public library, and you'd be surprised at how much exposure you would get from public spaces to drug residues as well. So these levels were not extremely over what you'll typically be exposed to anyway on your daily life, but you know, they can be if bags, for example, aren't sealed properly, etc. I'll just now go very quickly and discuss some of the other research findings that I've found outside of the drugs. When it comes to trace drugs, if any of you all are sampling from environments, it's just important to understand that some of that could be potentially some environments can affect the stability of the drugs depending on how long they've been out there and exposed to them, and they may give different results as a function of that, and I'll show you in just a bit. These are the ideal conditions that our studies have seen for each drug, and this is the exposure dates for that. Let's see. So we look at things such as UV, ozone, humidity, and heat chambers, and we try to recreate those kind of extreme temperatures or environmental conditions that the samples may be exposed to in real life, and we recreate it in the lab and we age the samples as a function of temperature and as a function of environmental condition and time. So what we found is, again, that most drugs are most stable after 7 days in a freezer. And then our laboratory conditions, as you start to see the fentanyl and the furanylfentanyl, for example, we started to lose 10 to 50% of the sample after that. And then, as I move to the right, you'll see that ozone, extreme heat, or UV, we start to lose over 50% of the sample. This is for trace amounts of drugs. On the other hand, after 35 days of exposing these samples to these conditions, only the freezer condition prevented us from losing over 20 to 50%. But you'll see, for example, that MDMA was very sensitive to these conditions, no matter what, after 35 days. Why is this so important? Well, in the case of something like GHB, if it is heat is increased and refrigeration is decreased, it actually changes the molecule from GHB to GBL. And so that's a chemical conversion that occurs as a function of the temperature that it's been exposed to. It's a hydrolysis. And the reason that's important is because if you detected GHB, that's a Schedule 1 drug, but if you detect GBL, that's just a list 1 chemical because it's used to manufacture other types of substances that are not controlled by the DEA. And so that's a good example of how the environmental condition can affect the results of the analysis of the evidence, even though you might have had a controlled substance to begin with. Due to the environmental exposure, it's now changed it to something that's going to affect the outcome of that particular case. Cathinones are also something that we know they're a psychoactive component, and cathinone is a Schedule 1 versus cathinine is a Schedule 4. And so the guidelines on drying the moist leaves at either room temperature or by the application of heat are an effective means of preserving any seized cat evidence for long-term storage. So all of this information we're hoping to compile into this report that's going to come out hopefully within the next year, I believe, that gives you kind of that nuance about each type of drug and what you may want to do in order to best preserve it. And in this case, you want to dry it really, really well to prevent that conversion. I don't think any of you all deal with the storage of explosives, but as you know, they're very sensitive to temperature and moisture. And so you want to make sure that there's no moisture, that they're not exposed to any moisture, because they can, the explosive crystallizes, and then there's a formation of that can cause a potential issue between the fuse and the main body of the munition. So every effort shall be made to ensure that there's dry conditions in the storage and transportation of explosives from a safety standpoint. We also did a similar study as the one that I showed with the drugs, and as you'll see, explosives are much more sensitive to environmental conditions than the drugs, and so in the case of, for example, HMX, there's very, very little you can do to preserve it. So at this point, you want to make sure that you analyze it as soon as possible. And then the question about storing it for long-term comes into play, because if you know that the evidence is being altered in such a way where you may not be able to either detect it, or it's altered in such a way in which it's not even close to the original evidence, I sometimes question whether it's even reasonable to store it for a long period of time. Fire debris, we also know, is very volatile, right? And so we want to make sure that it's stored and preserved as best as possible. We're in the middle of finishing up a study that shows best practices to store this type of evidence. And then, you know, a lot of this information doesn't necessarily come from what I would call the regular scientific community. It comes from affinity groups or other groups that are really interested in preservation from a different standpoint, not from a forensic standpoint, but for example, the NRA, they want to make sure that if you have a collectible firearm, they've done a bunch of studies to see, okay, how do we store these firearms to ensure their preservation? And so here they say, you know, 70 degrees year round with 50% relative humidity. And they know that if you expose it to too much humidity, the metal parts will start to corrode. And so we can definitely pull information from these sorts of groups. The same with the ammunition. There's guidelines that come from the Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturers Institute, and they have a general rule of thumb. No extreme high temperatures of over 150 degrees. Hopefully, from my example earlier, you know, obviously it's tough to get there, but it's not impossible, right? If you have something stored in the summer months in a car, for example, for hours and hours, it's potential that you get there. And then they provide a shelf life for these sorts of documents. We know heat accelerates deterioration. The rate of chemical reactions in this case is doubled as you increase in temperatures of 18 degrees. Then you have to also worry about mold growth and insect activity. Photographs, the same, right? Luckily, we're moving more and more towards a technology where you're able to store these things digitally, but a lot of times you have what you have, and so you need to be concerned with relative humidity and also temperature. So key takeaways, you want to monitor your climate, right? Both your temperature and your humidity during the entire life cycle of the evidence management. And so hopefully you've seen reasons to consider, you know, from when the evidence is first collected from a crime scene, a hospital, or maybe even a jail facility, and as it moves through the entire life cycle, comes through temporary storage, temporary storage places, and then also moves through transportation, and then finally to its long-term storage. It may go back to a lab for reanalysis, it may go to the court system, but all of these things need to interplay together in order to, again, maximize that preservation. All parties involved in chain of custody must follow best storage practices, right? It doesn't do us any good that, you know, you all are doing your best if the courts, for example, are not. The goal is to maximize the preservation. Some materials have a shelf life, and we've seen that, and they're inherently less stable than others. And so that should be considered and hopefully taken into account when people discuss how long to store evidence for. Again, if it really doesn't have much value from an evidentiary standpoint for reanalysis, et cetera, perhaps, you know, that should be reflected in the times in which certain type of evidence is stored. You want to minimize transit time between the collection of the evidence and its long-term storage. Law enforcement agency policies should reflect this effort, and you should consider implementing those mitigation strategies that I talked about earlier, and I'm sure there's many others that we can think about together on how to do that. Literature review results, temperature and humidity play a critical role in the preservation and the integrity of the evidence. You want to avoid extreme temperatures and high humidity. Most evidence is stable at room temperature at 35 to 65 humidity. Obviously, consider your safety aspects when you think about storage conditions. Please go to those resources, reach out to me. At NIST, we make the measurements, and then we rely on agencies like the CDC and NIOSH to then interpret what those measurements are in terms of risk for your safety and for workplace environments. But we work very closely together, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with anyone that, in case you have any issues. More research is needed to issue data-driven storage condition recommendations. So this was a call for any forensics labs that may be on the call today. You all have a wealth of information. Consider publishing your data, considering partnering with people who are interested in providing more guidance to the community at large. Here are some considerations for the researchers. And we want to make sure that we're leveraging other industries and sources, right? So as I mentioned, medical, pharmaceutical, food industries, they're all concerned on how to store, storage conditions, are concerned on how to transport things more effectively and make sure that they're not affected by the environmental conditions. So maybe we should leverage their practices and their technologies. And again, I'm heavily leaning on other types of institutes that consider preservation from a different angle, but I think that we can apply for this particular topic. And with that, I've come to the end of my slides, and I'm not sure if I have any time, but I'd be happy to take questions if so.
Yeah, it looks like, Marcella, looks like most of the questions have actually been answered by the team here. I am going to ask one question from Don. He says their recommendation is to store per protocol. We would like to continue with refrigeration. My question to the expert is if refrigeration after being frozen is detrimental to the evidence, should we change to frozen storage?
What type of evidence are we talking about in this case that's been frozen?
Yeah,
and
Don,
then
Don, if you were still here with us, you could clarify what type of evidence we're looking at that you were wanting to know. Oh, sex kits, sexual assault kits.
I think, yeah, there's the biological evidence preservation handbook, and I don't know from the top of my head whether that is covered in that, but we certainly have some experts in the evidence management committee on sexual assault kits that I would prefer to pass that question along just to double check on what that is. So if you don't mind, Craig, writing that one
No
for me,
problem.
I'd be happy to get back to you on that because that's a really good question.
Okay, yeah, it is a great question. So we can get back to you. Maybe someone from IAPE can answer that question more directly or direct to resources that might be helpful. And I'll ask another one here. It says we utilize a separate enclosed room within our storage facility for drugs. They were curious about the ideal temp for regular storage facility and the drug room.
I believe that they said about 70 to 75 degrees was what that report said, and they were mostly concerned about that humidity creeping up over that 50%, but I believe that was the temperature. But again, that CDC report would definitely, what's coming to mind right now is they just put room temp, and typically that's what they mean by room temp is 70 to 75 degrees. And their only issue with that Kentucky vault was that, again, that humidity had creeped up higher than 50% in the month of July. But if you go to that link, you can certainly find exactly the temperature that they recommended for it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Marcella. I have a few more here. We do have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll take a few of these for those that would like to stay. It says, is there a point where you has no evidence for we have urine in our fridge that's over 15 years old?
So those samples tend to be pretty stable, to be honest. It obviously depends on the type of drug that's present in your sample. But like I said, the literature, there's literature that shows that 16, I think that one article was like they've kept things for 18 years or so, and they were the sample was still stable. And I know places like the New York Toxicology Lab, they've stored samples for, double-digit type years. And what they do is they pull them every once in a while and reanalyze them with newer technology just to see if, newer, with more sensitive instruments, they see something in the sample that they weren't able to detect in the past, and they've had some success with that. So I think when it comes to those types of samples, they tend to be pretty stable, and it does tend to be beneficiary to keep them just in case there's advances in technology, again, that shed a little bit more light into what we weren't capable of detecting before.
Okay, another question here from George. He was wondering about related to urine. It's incoming urine or blood evidence, how long before refrigerated? I think it's related maybe to drugs, toxicology, or something related to that blood or urine sample. So how long to get that into the refrigerator?
I'm sorry, Craig, you were breaking up a little bit in that.
Breaking up?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, incoming urine and blood evidence, how long before refrigeration?
That again is in the biological handbook. I believe it's as soon as possible that it needs to go in there. Is there quite like I'm interpreting the question as it comes in and you have it like in waiting before you put it in the refrigerator? Is that what?
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, I'm thinking that's what they're asking. Yes.
Yeah, I would say as soon as possible that needs to go in the refrigerator. Again, maybe putting it in something like that that bag that I was talking about, right? That reduces the temperature exposure to it, but ASAP would be my recommendation there.
Okay. Another question regarding a major mold growth in their fridge. It was discovered that the humidity control was never put in place. My concern is with the extensive mold spores in the fridge that could be airborne, as well as eradicating the mold once the problem is corrected. So basically dealing with that mold that may be in that fridge related to that evidence.
Sure. Yeah, so that would be evidence that there wasn't proper control, right? Like they mentioned, of the humidity. And
Mhm.
I believe that the CDC handbook had some recommendations on how to clean mold and mold spores in
Okay.
particular, if you do encounter them, um, and then how to ensure that it doesn't come back. So I would look in that handbook to see, sometimes, once you get the mold in there and the conditions aren't um, improved, it just keeps coming back and it keeps coming back. So people sometimes choose to get rid of whatever they had to begin with and start fresh. Obviously, that's not always possible, but I would look into how they recommend it to get rid of those spores, what they used.
Okay, great. Thank you, Marcel. I have another one here. It says my long-term freezer went out over the weekend, and all the property was at 77 degrees. What possible degradation would occur with the property? And what are or should be my concerns?
What was there? What type of property was it?
Yeah, so maybe you could clarify what kind of property was in that freezer.
But off the top of my head, 77 um, it's not an extreme temperature, but I would certainly log it somewhere that happened to the evidence,
Okay.
and notify people right away that happened. I mean, there's really nothing you can do when that happens other than some people choose to have these alarms on the freezers that lets you know if there's a critical point in which it goes below or above a certain level. And I know that that's been very useful. It notifies personnel that's happened, and then you can go in and hopefully transfer the evidence or attend to it much faster than just walking into it after a long weekend or something like that. Yeah, it would depend on the type of evidence that was in there. 77 doesn't sound like an extreme temperature that we were talking about, but
Yeah, it was DNA.
oh, sure. So I would also, so that the biological evidence is not something that I particularly worked with very closely. Again, that handbook was put together a number of years by NIST and NIJ and published. And so
Mhm.
that anything DNA, sexual assault kit, et cetera, falls a little bit outside my area of expertise. So I'm sorry that I don't have the answer right on top of my head. But yeah, DNA may be one of those cases where a change in temperature like that may be more problematic.
Okay. Yeah, I know people here at IEP2 can help address that question for you, and there's resources online to help address that. So thank you, Marcel. I appreciate that. Just based on the time, I think we got a few more questions here, but I'm going to let the team at IEP address those questions offline. And I would just like to thank everyone that's here. I know that Joe Latta has something briefly to share with everyone before we close out here. So Joe, if you're still out there, I probably need to pull you off mute here. So let me do that really quick because I think you did. And then I will be able to let you address the class.
Craig, are you reading me okay?
I am hearing you fine.
Okay. Folks, I'll be here for about a minute. And I wanted to comment on one or two things. We keep hearing about the biological handbook. If you go to our website or if you go to Google and run the Biological Evidence Preservation Handbook, Best Practices for Evidence Handlers, is an 80 or 90-page document, and it talks all about the various temperatures we should store biological. It's an outstanding document. It's been out there for about 8 years. One of the other discussions a minute ago talking about our drug rooms, one of the things that the standards have been talking about over the last 10 years is that the room is, if you're in a small police department and everything's in one drawer, we're not talking about it. When we have a room for your drugs, not only is the temperature, the air quality is, and everything talks about negative pressure. And that's when air is forced into the room and ejected out of the building, not up into the air conditioning system, out of the building. And it talks, I believe, 12 to 15 changes an hour. And that's all I'm going to say about our topic today. Craig is going to bring up a slide here to let everybody know, because we've been dealing with the COVID issue, it's made our scheduling a little bit crazy. If you were registered for any class from today forward, you might want to check our schedules. A lot of those, in fact, the majority of them, we've rescheduled, and moving forward, we're still going to do a lot of them. You can see them on the screen there. Some of them are even moving over into 2021. So we haven't canceled most of them, but we have rescheduled. Craig, go ahead and go to the next schedule. As you can see, some of these were all scheduled this year. We just added Las Vegas for next year. Those of you that were scheduled for the Portland class, we have not posted it on here. It'll be up today probably. We're going to be moving down to Salem, Oregon. If you need the training right away, our entire class is online, just like a Netflix. You can watch what you want for a few minutes and come back later in the afternoon, watch it on the weekend. It's good for 30 days. It's the same tuition. It's been received very well because we can't leave, we can't go in any live training, so you may want to consider that. It also comes with our textbook that we have. It's about 400 pages of property and evidence. That's included with the class if you buy it online. So you get the video class online and the book for the same price. And with that, I would like to Marcella, thank you so very much. We've been struggling with these things in our world for years and years and years. How do you store it? Well, just put it in the refrigerator, just put it in the freezer. And there's never been any science behind that. So the fact is we're moving forward and coming up with some of these standards. It's outstanding. And we really appreciate you, and we appreciate NIST getting down and making this a study that is scientific, not that, oh, that's the way we've always done it. So Craig, that's all I've got.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. As I shared before, this will be available tomorrow. You should receive an email with a link to rewatch this if you choose. We will be having an upcoming webinar. File on Q will be showing a little bit more about the platform I mentioned earlier, and really how it helps address that elephant that's in your room, which includes all of these areas of struggles and how the platform addresses that. So stay tuned. That's September 23rd. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Marcella, and everyone here. Have a great rest of the week, and do not hesitate to reach out to us if you have questions regarding training or anything you saw here today. Thank you, and have a great rest of the week. Oh, and also there's a survey at the end too, if you want to take that and let us know how we did. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.